To everyone. Thank you all for coming to the VIF this morning for a roundtable conference on India's foreign policy towards the African continent in the 21st century and prospect for cooperation. I would like to particularly welcome the ambassadors and high commissioners, diplomats who have made it possible to help us organize this very important conference. So I'd like to extend my welcome to His Excellency Mr. Alem Wolder-Mariam, Ambassador of the State of Eritrea and the Dean of the African Ambassadors in India. Excellency Tizita Mulugeta, Ambassador Extraordinary and Plenipotentiary of the Federal Republic of Ethiopia. Excellency Ahmed Gabriel, Charge d'Affaires, State of Libya. Excellency Tahina Rasmalina, Charge d'Affaires of the Republic of Madagascar. Excellency Major General Chris Sunday Eze, High Commission of the Republic of Nigeria, High Commissioner. Excellency Ernest Rwamusue, High Commission of Rwanda. Excellency Faduma Abdullahi Mohammed, Ambassador of the Embassy of Federal Republic of Somalia and Uganda. Yeah. Excellency Sibuase Nebele, High Commissioner of South Africa. High Commissioner Mrs. Judith Kangoma Kapijimanga of Zambia, and Ugandan High Commissioner Madam Grace Akilo. I would also like to welcome our distinguished colleagues, Ambassador Anil Trugunayat, who has really put together this conference and worked very hard, and a colleague Dr. Neha Sinha, who has been in touch with you. But I would also like to welcome Ambassador Rajiv Bhatia, who is known to all of you, is been the driving force in the academic circles on India-Africa relations and always helped us organize many of these events. Professor Ajay Dubey, also a stalwart in African studies. Professor Rajan Harshe, stalwart in African studies, and my other colleagues. We have in the VIF from time to time have held a number of discussions on India-Africa relations. In fact, if we look at last, say, 5 to 7 years, I think India-Africa relations have progressed quite significantly. And the 2015 India-Africa Forum Summit Forum meeting, that was a landmark. And now, of course, we are looking towards the next such meeting, fourth meeting, which will be held next year, hopefully. But this interaction has already set up a roadmap for India-Africa relations, and a number of positives have already come out from this. And I just want to highlight a few of these achievements, just to underline the fact that Africa today, African countries, the continent, and of course we know that Africa is not just one, but there's more than 50 countries. These occupy a very important role in India's foreign policy. And the one manifestation of this is the fact that close to 30 visits at the level of our President, Vice President, Prime Minister, that is the highest level in the government, have already taken place to Africa. in the last 5 years. So that signifies the priority and importance that India now attaches to its relations with Africa. And this high-level engagement, which is very, very important because it sets the tone for India-Africa relations, is going to continue in the future. And I think the last India-Africa Forum summit was very important, and a number of decisions came out of that. Out of a commitment of 50,000 slots for capacity building over the last 5 years, I think 40,000 have already been fulfilled. So 40,000 people have been trained. And out of the lines of credit target of US $10 billion, something like we have pledged more than US $6 billion already. So that is a substantial achievement. And India, I understand, has already become the 5th largest investor in Africa, with a cumulative investment of US $54 billion. And the sizable investments have gone into oil and gas, mining, banking, pharma, textiles, and other sectors in Africa. And our trade has already increased to about $62 billion, that is the 17-18 figure, which was an increase of about 20% over the previous year. Our development cooperation programs are also progressing reasonably well. And today we have such programs in power projects and dams in Sudan, Rwanda, to water treatment in Tanzania, sugar factory in Ethiopia, IT parks in Mozambique and Swaziland, etc. Now, these are just some of the examples, and there are many are under discussion in the pipeline. And this is not to say that this is the end of it. I think the importance of consultations and then deciding on what is required, improving the functioning of the lines of credit, removing the bottlenecks through consultations, I think is a very important factor. And some of our investment is now going into improving in the modern sectors like the IT, which is becoming very important. And I think there is tremendous potential, IT, entrepreneurship, etc. And as I understand from the Ministry of External Affairs and other officials, that the importance of consultations and importance of what is required and which meets the needs of people and people on the ground, that is a very important element of our planning and execution. I think I could go on like this, but we will be discussing this in the conference. The important point to be considered in this conference, I think, is to really learn from you how you look at the India-Africa cooperation. This is, of course, the figures, and there will always be figures hide many things which are probably not necessarily very pleasant, in the sense that there could be bottlenecks, there could be constraints which need to be improved upon. And in a think tank atmosphere format, we can talk frankly and candidly, and I would request you to tell us how we can improve our engagement and cooperation. Africa, of course, is an emerging continent, a continent full of opportunities. And in the last few years, there has been a tremendous diversification in our foreign policy. And India is no longer just a South Asia country. It's looking at far and wide. It's if you look at the number of countries which India, the Prime Minister, President, Vice President, Foreign Minister have covered in the last 5-7 years, you would see that probably more than 150 countries have already been covered. So the idea is to reach out to everyone and here we also take the help of our diaspora. There are about 3 million people of Indian origin in Africa. And as you would have seen, diaspora is now beginning to play an extremely important role in India's foreign policy. And I think Africa is one of our oldest diaspora, very important. And of course, I cannot help but bring the name of Mahatma Gandhi. But diaspora even predates Mahatma Gandhi. In fact, I'm reading these days a book on written by one African lady of Indian origin about Indian diaspora and how it grew in the 19th century. In Tanzania, in Zanzibar, in Kenya, and other places. It's a fascinating read because many of these things, in fact, are not really known. So, diaspora can be harnessed in a very positive sense. I know sometimes the diaspora, etc., this leads to other kinds of problems. But now I think we are in a different age. Now we connect with each other very well. People are very well educated. And Indian diaspora, I think, all relates very well to India. So we must bring and enhance the role of diaspora as a bridge between India and Africa, and they can certainly play a very important role. Then, of course, India and Africa. Africa itself is, rebuilding itself. You have so many regional organizations. You're playing a very important role in the global affairs. And India-Africa cooperation on global issues, and not just the bilateral, on global and regional issues, is also very important. Today, we see that there is almost a crisis in the institutions of global governance. Whether it is the issue of climate change or issues of global trade. Of course, SDGs are very important, but we see that many of the issues of global governance are atrophied. And today we have a multipolar world, but in this multipolar world, how will global governance look like? Clearly, the older institutions are not sufficient. And we have seen the UN Security Council, which still is not a representative organization. And many of these institutions of global governance have become dysfunctional or have become very agenda-driven. How do India and Africa cooperate to improve global governance, which is in the interest of everybody on the planet? I think that should also be a very important part of our functioning. We are also seeing a new balance of power which is emerging. There is a lot of focus on connectivity, on the building of infrastructure. Not all of this is innocent, and it comes with agendas, sometimes obvious, sometimes hidden agendas. I think we need a very good dialogue between Indian and African nations, India and African nations, to mutually clarify what it all means. So we need not just remain confined to the bilateral issues, but we should take on board some of these transformations which are underway. Because Africa and India, both in 21st century, are going to rise. Africa is going to play a very important role in the new multipolar world that is arising. So we would very much welcome the views of African leaders, African people, as to how they look at this 21st century. So that is, I think, another, in a think tank setting, we could look at improving our interaction on such issues like climate change, capacity building, terrorism, I think, which is also an extremely important area. So I will stop here, and I will now request my colleague, Ambassador Anil Trigunath, to conduct the show from here. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, Ambassador Gupta. Excellencies, senior colleagues, friends, and research scholars, we are indeed very grateful to you, especially our speakers and ambassadors, high commissioners, who have spared some time this morning to discuss this very important relationship to which, as you all have seen in recent past, attached great importance in our foreign policy domain. Our relationship is not only historic and civilizational, but as I say, it is also umbilical. We were at one time joined. So therefore, that thing pervades even now in our relationship. It pervades in our thinking. But there has always been a sort of a goodwill, a desire, an intent to enhance the relationship. It has started since the early 50s. But what we are seeing today is a much greater change in our focus. And that focus is essentially as a result of, and I'm glad the Ugandan High Commissioner is here, as a result of a policy that has been for the first time clearly articulated by our Prime Minister when he addressed the Ugandan Parliament 2 years ago. And that is the policy that decides, and it was several priorities and basic principles was enshrined, which puts India apart in a very different category compared to some other countries that are trying to gain foothold in that place. The key issues that he mentioned were that Africa is among top priorities for India, and momentum of cooperation will be sustained through regular exchanges. And as the director has said, that to Africa alone, for the first time in our history in the last few years, we have had more than 36 visits, and the last one was by the Vice President. Our Vice President went to Vanilla Islands, Comoros, and Sierra Leone just last month. Before that, you may realize that it was also for the first time that the Indian Minister of External Affairs, State for External Affairs, Mr. Muralidharan, went to Nigeria. That was his first visit abroad. So that also indicates that India is focusing at the highest political level, because that has been one of the gaps in our interactions. We had African leaders visiting India. We also had India-Africa Forum summits and all. But outgoing visits from India at the level of Prime Minister, Vice President, and President had a hiatus, which was almost decades, which is not explained by anything. Especially when you have large number of leaders in Africa who have been educated in India, and they are personally driving Indo-African relationships. So therefore, it is extremely important. But the most important thing in this whole thing I find is, in our focus is, which is the development partnership as per African priorities. Preferential access to Indian markets for African products, which we are already doing. Assist in harnessing digital revolution in Africa, improve Africa's agricultural potential. And we look at it not only as that, but we also look at it in the trilateral context with Middle East and Africa and India for food security. That is extremely important for creating food supply chains, which will be value added eventually and will provide Africa. I was in Nigeria and nobody eats the mangoes there, and they have so many mangoes. They were just destroyed. So they could be really, that way there are plenty of things that can be done together. And this fight climate change, as the director said, together. Work together to keep oceans and maritime lanes free for all, because trade and maritime navigation is extremely important. And they are global goods and they need to be protected. Africa, instead of becoming a theater of competition, should become nursery for its youth, because you are going to have, after 2050, the largest, youngest population in the world. And they are going to be the consumers, they are going to be the driving force. And that is precisely the reason I attribute to the fact that we are looking post in the second half of this century as the Afro-Asian century. Africa should be able to drive that thing. Of course, we have to have representative, just, democratic global order, and that is extremely important for any growth in any country. Personally, for me, of course, you can use the whole of alphabet to define how the relationship, but I've tried to put together 3 or 4 points. For example, there are 3 C's I look at it, which is connectivity, counterterrorism, and capacity building. 4Ds, defense, digitalization, diamonds and diaspora. Then 3Es, exceptional outreach, economic engagement and energy security. These are some of the areas in which we can work together. And as the director mentioned, and I must tell you that just last week we had a lecture which you heard, which was one of the most exceptional lectures by the Indian External Affairs Minister, Dr. S. Jaishankar, at the Ramnath Goenka lecture, where he spoke about India's foreign policy in the last 70 years, how it has come, where it is going, and where it is leading, and what are the priorities. And those of you who were there would realize that the only country that he mentioned, only continent rather, that he mentioned 5 times was Africa in his speech. And another thing that we are doing is, for the first time, this is the only place where we are opening new diplomatic missions. The 18 diplomatic missions have gone, many of them have been opened and are going to be open. So this is something that we are looking. Of course, we are collaborating in ECOWAS, we are collaborating in African Development Bank, in Nepal, Team 9, and we are looking to collaborate with your ACFTA, the free trade agreement that has come out, which is the greatest thing. So when the Africans are shaping their own destiny, their own future, we are going to be a partner for you, not only in capacity building, but in any which way that the Africans want India to be. So in this panel, I'm honored to be coordinating the panel of ambassadors and high commissioners. And my request to you is, while you will be talking about bilateral relations, is as to how we can give me 2 or 3 suggestions which can be fed into the system so that we can take this relationship to a much higher orbit than it is presently. Or if there are any major problems that you face in our relationship. And on our part, I think, as once I was traveling in Cameroon and I saw a word written, this is afritude. I think on our part as Indians, we need to understand what afritude is and work diligently on that. With these words, it is my great honor to invite His Excellency, the Ambassador of Eritrea, who is the Dean of African States, and a country that has really emerged and is doing much better now than the kind of history they have followed. Excellency.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. Morning. I can say, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, instead of mentioning everybody. It is an honor for me as ambassador of the state of Eritrea to India, and equally as Dean of the African Heads of Missions in India, to address this August gathering on such a strategic topic of India's foreign policy towards Africa continent in 21st century. Prospects for cooperation. At the outset, allow me to start by thanking the Indian nation to have stood by the continent of Africa all along their historical and political symbiosis. Sources. Today, we are physical witnesses of the transformational phase of the Indian political and socio-economic environment. India is developing and is poised to have a seat among the historical global powers. This mutation of a country that old narrative defined as a stagnant giant is indubitably going to bring changes in new world order considered to be characterized by multipolarity. Africa, being one of the great partners of India, is definitely going to have a center position in this country's foreign policy. The number of Indian embassies and high commissioners in Africa, in African capitals, has almost doubled in the past 5 years. And the reading of the current dispensation gives us the latitude of believing that there is a continued and growing momentum. Africa is already benefiting from India's growth, as the trade between the two has increased 20 times in the past 15 years. India alone provided 152 loans to almost 44 African countries, and the amount is approximately 8 billion USD. Significant funds have been released by India for the development of African countries through the India-Africa Forum Summit 3 and through the several bilateral and multilateral engagements. India is indeed in the heart of Africa's growth with consideration of various sectors of development. Ladies and gentlemen, the 7 decades of India's foreign policy have brought another approach in Indian vision, that of a pragmatic way of doing, and Africa needs that sense of breaking with a bureaucratic doctrine if it eyes for fast development. India has understood with time that doctrines and concepts in foreign policy are no longer the only methodology, that countries which do not want to be left behind need to evolve with time and space. In its partnership with Africa, countries of the African continent will have to move on the same pace with India, realizing outcomes with less words. India and Africa, being the global youngest population, the opportunities between the two partners are enormous, considering the Indian growing technology and the African quest for development and value addition to its vast resources. If these comparative advantages are harnessed honestly and intelligently, India and Africa will without any doubt claim the 21st century. As the Honorable Minister of External Affairs of India, Shri Jaishankar, put it in his recent speech at the 4th Ramnath Goenka Lecture 2019, technology, connectivity, and trade will define the future cooperation. India and Africa will mutually gain from the upcoming technologies for increased growth and intelligent competition. Ladies and gentlemen, if the international order is experiencing deep transformation in all sectors and is heading more to multipolarity, the world will continue facing uncertainty. India and Africa will have to join hands and contribute to the world's serenity. Both partners will have to increase trade and economic cooperation, as well as partnering in global positions, mainly in the UN Forum. In conclusion, the African continent and India are big players of the 21st century, as their economies are set to continue growing given the human and economic resources opportunities at their disposal. African continent will only need to understand, like India, that the transforming world is an opportunity for development given the diverse choices offered by the current world political and economic environment. Thank you.
Thank you, Excellency, for the roadmap and for your words that are going to help us. Now I'll request Her Excellency Dr. Tizita Murugeta, Ambassador of Ethiopia, a country from where the civilization began. Mm-hmm. And congratulations for the Nobel Peace Prize for your leader.
Thank you and good morning. First of all, I would like to say thank you very much for VIF for organizing this special conference. I believe that this conference really would help us just to express and also acknowledge the cooperation and also to investigate what are some of the challenges that we are supposed to work on it. So thank you very much and good morning to all of you. So I just want to focus on kind of 4 issues that I believe that are like enabling factors for cooperation between India and African continent as a continent. One of the issue is like the issue of South-South cooperation. I believe that it is well known that India and Africa as a country have common interest and they share many common grounds. For instance, whether we believe it or not, both Africa and India are developing in a developing status. So the issue of strengthening the foreign policy depends on strengthening cooperation in political, economic, social, cultural, environmental, and technical domain. And both Africa as a continent and India as a country are peace lovers, and they work towards correcting the world system. Nowadays, it's really very difficult to predict in which way that the world is going. To some extent, it seems that it's going to be polarized. The multilateral issues is becoming vanishing. So Africa and India need to determine what is going to be their position in this regard. And they have to cooperate each other to determine on how the way forward. And also, I believe in terms of world political system, both Africa as a continent and India as a country do not have a permanent representation in the UN. And they both believe in the necessity of the UN reform. So India and India-Africa Forum and also AU, I believe, would really serve as a means to reflect and also to discuss issues under this South-South cooperation. Okay, what is the position of India in terms of having representation in the UN, and also Africa. Of course, there is the G4 that India is working in, but beyond that, in what way that they are going to get the representation in the UN has also been discussed together so that they can work on reforming the UN. The other issue is anti-terrorism issue. Both Africa and India recognize the challenge of international terrorism, and they believe that security and defense are very important sector for the socio-economic development of both India and Africa. And so far, India and Africa have defense partnership. For instance, India assisted to set up military academy in Ethiopia. They're setting up Air Force in Ghana, and also they're setting up Defense Force and Naval College in Nigeria and others. Still, Africa wants defense and anti-terrorism ties with India. And India currently is providing different kind of peacekeeping troops and training to defense personnel for African countries, and can support in developing even civil nuclear energy for peaceful use and sale of small arms. So working in this anti-terrorism act would help to strengthen their cooperation. And the other issue is the issue of democratization. It is well known that India has a well-established democracy and a well-established federal system. So, giving its strong commitment to democracy, Africa still expects India to be at the forefront of promoting democracy as an ideal political system. So, democracy promotion abroad, I believe, involves various assistance. For instance, assistance in developing political party development, assistance in electoral monitoring, supporting independent medias, supporting independent journalists, capacity building for state institutions, training of judges, training of civil group leaders, legislators,